So really, with that being said, I guess I'll just get into it. There's not really a whole lot to get into this. Does anyone already have? I didn't actually have the ability to send you guys an announcement. So does anyone already have like Node installed on their machine? One person. Cool. So if you guys actually, I guess I'll start with that. So we're going to be working with the latest LTS of Node, which I believe is 10 something. So you can just go to nodejs.org and download the latest version under LTS, which is 10.15.0. If you guys are using Mac, you guys can also download what is called NVM. It's completely optional, but it's the Node version manager. And if you want to jump between different versions, go into the current release as opposed to long term, you can use kind of features that are not in the current LTS. But with that, once you download and install it onto your machine, when you open up your terminal and you type in node v, let me bump that up a little bit, you'll be able to see what your current Node version is. Yeah? Good question. I usually use NVM, which is the easiest way if you're on Mac. Without that, usually once you download and install, there's not much. It's just kind of like patches. Node update. I think it's something through npm that you can do. It's not a command that I do very often. That's for updating npm. Of course, they're recommending NVM. Really, if you're at 10.14, that'll be fine. There's not much difference between 10.14. 10.10, that'll still probably be fine. Really, it's the major versions that are at the beginning that will make a difference. So once you install Node, it's pretty easy in order to just run a tiny file. So okay, so you guys know JavaScript files end in .js, and when you write JavaScript, how you run the file is by typing in node. So that way you're saying the program that you're using, and then the file that you want to run it against, which, okay. So that's how you run the file. When we get into more stuff using NPM, it'll be a little bit easier because you can set up scripts that will automatically run files for you, so you don't have to worry about doing that. Is anyone uncomfortable with using the command line? Because I would just to let you know that command line is pretty important, but if you're not comfortable with it, we can kind of just go over that a little bit.
Sorry, what if you just do this? So you're running that console log on the command line?
Yeah, so what Node does is it uses the V8 engine, which is what Chrome uses to run JavaScript inside Chrome. So when you do a console.log, it will be very similar to any other programming languages that you've done that's printing to the command line. So in this case, if I were to run this file inside Chrome, it would be inside the DevTools in here very similar. So if I did a console.log test, it will do the exact same thing. So when you run Node, any sort of console logging that you do by default will just go into your terminal.
Okay, so you're in the directory where that file is?
Correct. Yes.
So you just say node and then the name of the file?
Correct. Yeah. So really the first thing that I guess we'll go over after we get Node installed is just kind of like a quick overview of everything. You guys all have GitHub accounts. If you do not have a GitHub account, just put up your hand. Cool. You guys know how to make a package, or sorry, how to make a repository, how to push code, pull code, all that sort of stuff, committing. All right. So this just kind of goes over it. I'll just quickly go over this because none of you guys really need to know the GitHub stuff because you guys are familiar with it. I'm not going to record this again. But these slides will be available if you need a reference on Blackboard once I have access to it. And for those that came in, I do not have access to Blackboard yet, but we will get to that. And also, if I'm going too quick, just let me know. This is my first class, so I'm sorry if I'm going really quick. So yeah, once you guys know version control, you guys can, when you do a commit, it takes what your current code is at that time, and you can revert back to it. You can split off of it, and being able to just go and see what code is at different points where you have set a point. So that's kind of what Git is. And then GitHub is just a hosted cloud version of that, so that way you can push your code up to GitHub and be able to pull it down from any machine and be able to share it with people. Whereas when you're just using Git normally, it is just local. Good reasons to use GitHub, version control, so that way if you make any mistakes or if you need to grab something from the past, it's pretty good, as well as when you're working in a large team, it makes it really easy to be able to see who did what, and if stuff is potentially accidentally removed, and just being able to just make sure that people are responsible for their sections. Again, you can keep your code in one place. GitHub recently, if you guys know, has now allowed unlimited private packages. So before it used to be if you were only on the student plan offered by GitHub, that you could have unlimited, but now anyone without paying can have unlimited private repositories. I think it was limited to 3 before. And then collaboration. I don't know if anyone has ever worked with open source before, but GitHub is one of the most popular ones for being able to share code and being able to collaborate with other people. So you guys have an account, create a repository, you just create a new repository with the button, create new. It'll ask you for the name. You can write a description, it's optional, and then you can choose if it's either public or private. And once you click it, you have your repository. And then that is usually when you would add it to your project. Then you guys know how to commit, and really that is that. It's a really quick one. Also, is anybody having issues installing Node or has had issues? All right. Yep.
How do you find out what version?
You can type into the terminal. You can type in node space and then -v, V for version, like this, and that will give you your node version. It's not working. You're on Windows? Have you closed your terminal and reopened it since installing? Yeah?
Actually, I was actually was on the previous one, and maybe the 10.1.
Just type in command prompt. Yep. So that's working, and there it is. There. Okay.
You recommend 10 in the font, you said?
Yes. If you download 11, really, again, so if anyone is familiar with how Linux works, when they release versions, there's always an LTS, and then there's a current version. And the LTS is for support, so that way you can have a stable release, and the only thing that ever ends up coming out on that LTS, long-term support, is patch fixes. Whereas if you download current, that one is constantly updated, and potentially there are new features that come out. So that's why we're going to work with the LTS, so that way it's stable. There's nothing that's going to be new that's introduced or anything that breaks, hopefully. All right. So, with that being said, let's get into lesson 2. Part 2. Oh, I did stream that. Cool. Okay. So the MERN stack, as I said, stands for Mongo, Express, React, Node. And with that, we'll kind of go over a little bit of what that is. As I said, we won't be touching React until after the reading week, but potentially if we end up going by, we might be able to touch on it before if we're lucky. So those are just the logos for each of the things that we're going to be using. Mongo is now, what is it? So what we're going to be using for Mongo is called MLab. It's a hosted version of a Mongo database. When I have access to Blackboard, again, but registering for MLab will be done later on. But it just allows you to be able to, instead of hosting Mongo on our machines, because, I mean, it seems like every single class you guys have to install something new onto your machines. So we're just going to be using cloud version. We don't have to worry about installing anything. Makes it pretty easy. So what is the MERN stack? So it's a full stack JavaScript solution that comprises of the 4 major building blocks that I have already mentioned. So Mongo is the database, Express is a web server framework, React is the front-end framework, Node.js is the server platform. So the code that you will write in Node.js is going to run on the server in the similar way that PHP is only ever run on the server, and you don't typically see that code on the front end unless if there is something that happens. So Node is usually pretty good that you don't accidentally have Node code that shows up on the front end, but stranger things have happened. So these blocks can be used by different development teams. They involve a substantial community of developers and advocates pushing forward the development and documentation of each component. So the big thing that's really important about the MERN stack is all of these tools are using JavaScript. You get to know one language, you can write on the front end, you can write on the back end. Your database models are done in the exact same format, and it's really easy. They all integrate very well. So that's what's great, is now you're starting to have front-end developers that previously only had experience with JavaScript that now potentially could write back-end code. Whereas before they would have to know some sort of framework like PHP, C# to be able to write code that's on the back end. So now it's kind of blurring the lines a little bit, and it just makes it really easier because then you don't have to know 2 different languages, you only have to know 1. So the problem of connecting these tools together can lay between the foundation for scaling and architecture issues, which can dramatically affect your development process. So just like anything, if you end up integrating different parts incorrectly, it's not going to work. The tooling around it can be a little bit difficult to get your mind wrapped around at first, but we're going to be kind of going on some of these things. They're going to be really basic at first, and you guys should be able to get the idea of that. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Don't be scared. So most modern web applications are built in a 3-tier architecture that consists of 3 important layers: data, logic, and presentation. So this is true even in sometimes just front-end applications where you have things that are responsible for fetching data, and you have things that are responsible for displaying that data. So that's kind of what those are split into. In web applications, the application structure usually breaks down into database, server, and client. While in modern web development, it can also be broken into database, server logic, and client UI. So when we start working with React, that's where you will see that most. In order for that to work, usually you have a database that, as you guys know, stores all of your different like variables and stuff like that, stuff that you want to display. So then the server will usually be responsible for grabbing that data from the database. It passes it to the client side. The client side then decides how it wants to display that the stuff on the front end, which then is displayed in the client UI. So I had a photo for it, and of course it's on Blackboard that you guys won't be able to see. That has a good example of how the different sections pass data between. But you guys, of course, are already familiar with that a little bit. So the paradigm that we're using is MVC, which you guys are familiar with, Model View Controller. Here's the actual one of the photos that shows that the user makes a request, it goes to the controller. The controller usually uses the model to then request the data, which is then passed to the view, and the view is displayed to the user. So MERN. The concept behind is that you only have to use JavaScript, single language for the application. All parts of the application can support and often enforce the user enforce the use of MVC, and then there's serialization and deserialization of data structures that's no longer needed because it's all in JSON objects. That stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So you guys are familiar with objects in JavaScript. So again, when you put this into a NoSQL database, you can end up just taking exactly what is there and throwing it up there. There's no kind of setting up complex insert statements, update statements. It's great. Whatever you have, you just throw it up. It's there. You don't have to worry about it. It makes it a little bit more confusing when you start to then have nested data and being able to update that, but there's tools that are out there that make it a little bit easier. So JSON objects, JavaScript object notation, represents data in JavaScript arrays. And previous to JSON, there was XML, which if you guys are familiar with XML, looks very similar to how you write like an HTML document. So JSON was used because it's more readable, it's lighter weight, it's faster because it has less characters in it, so you don't have to send as much data. And then stuff, like I said, MongoDB, you can store it. There's a couple different formats that you can store JSON in for being able to search it. But yeah, so that's really a JSON object. There's an example right here if you are unfamiliar with it. So you have the curly braces, which will determine that it's an object. The first part is a key that is the reference to it. And then the second part is the value. So in this case, we just have a bunch of strings joined, and last active are string values of a date, which dates are handled a little bit weird when it comes to different database types. And then it's wrapped in these square brackets, meaning that it's an array. So that's how that works. When we get into how the MERN stack fits, this is where I was talking about having the different pieces that all work together. So you have the client that makes the request. This is going to be handled most likely by React.js, but there are a ton of different other front-end frameworks that you're more than welcome to use. In fact, when we start out with Node, we're not actually going to have that front-end framework. It's just going to be, we're going to be using, I don't know if anyone has worked with Pug. You worked with Node in the past, or just NPM, right? Okay. So we're going to be using what is called a templating engine. You guys have probably used templating engines in ASP.NET. Did you guys use the Razor syntax at all, if that sounds familiar to anyone? Where you can inject variables into the HTML files? Yeah.
I use that.
You've used it? Okay. Anyone else? Also, if you're using PHP where you just print out a variable, you can do echo or some sort of way where you inject variables into the HTML content. So that's what a templating engine is for, where you can have data that is passed to it, and then you display it or do stuff with it. So in this case, again, the client makes a request that goes to the front end. The front end will then send stuff to Node.js that will handle the client and server requests. Express is built on top of it. This is not exactly the best photo of it. Express kind of wraps around Node.js. It just makes it a little bit easier in order to handle requests. It is not to the side of it. And then, of course, that will make a request to your database, come all back. You guys kind of get the repetitiveness of how this works. So what is Node.js? When Google announced in 2008 their new V8 JavaScript engine, it was obvious that JavaScript could run faster. Before this, JavaScript was not slow, but it's not as fast as a lot of other programming languages, as opposed to JavaScript is a programming language that runs on the client's browser. So a lot of the ways that it was done between different browsers was inconsistent. And with V8, it made it a lot faster to run these things. So before, it was a lot of basic being able to hide elements, show elements, animate, but there wasn't a lot of complex things that had been done. Or if there was, it was kind of limited by the architecture of the operating system that's being used, especially when we look at phones nowadays. Phones going back to 2008 we're in exactly the speediest. So we were kind of running into hardware limitations because the only programming language that you can use on the front end, asterisk besides WASM, is JavaScript. So V8's greatest advantage over other JavaScript engines was the compiling of JavaScript code to native machine code before executing it. So this made it a little bit faster, but again, you also had to take in the time of compilation instead of running it real time, because JavaScript is what is called, it's not a compiled language. Like, has anyone used Java? A couple people. So as you know, you write in a .java file, and then you compile it, and it's into a .class file. So that doesn't happen with JavaScript. You have a .js file, you write it, and you run it, and it's all the same file. There's never a change. Other programming languages that are similar to that is like Python, where it's, again, just running a .py file, and other similar stuff like that. So this and other optimizations made JavaScript a viable programming language, because now, instead of having this slower language, we were now able to do a lot faster stuff with it. And Node was a project that ended up taking that V8 engine and being able to execute it on the server side as opposed to Chrome using it on the front end side. So there's a couple different ways that you can program in Node.js. JavaScript is kind of a functional programming language as opposed to a object-oriented language. So when you guys have made classes in C#, you can extend off of other things. And usually the kind of basic part is that you have an animal, and then you create a dog class that extends off of animal, and then you can create a German Shepherd that extends off a dog, and it gets more and more specific. Whereas in functional programming, there's not as much of that. When you are trying to go over data, there's a lot of different methods that you can use to loop over data. You don't just use a for loop. But then there's also event-driven programming. So in Node.js, you can use what are called events, and you can listen to those events. So when something happens in your program, you can emit an event that will be of whatever you determine it to be, and then you can execute code that is listening to that event. So this is called event-driven. It's an event-driven language, but is also a functional language. So this allows you to execute what is called asynchronous code, which we'll kind of get into in a little bit, just because asynchronous versus synchronous code can sometimes be a little bit confusing if anyone has ever done it. Show of hands if you've worked with asynchronous code before. A couple people.
JavaScript before, so I guess I have.
Sorry?
Well, I've worked with JavaScript before, so I guess I have.
Okay. So are you familiar with promises?
A little bit.
A little bit?
Something to do with JSON, right?
Yeah. So I'll go over that in a little bit, but basically there's a couple different ways that you can work with unexpected responses. So when you make a request for data, you don't necessarily know how long that request is going to take. So if you wanted to make a request to, let's say, google.com, if you're on a slow connection, you don't know that it could take 60 seconds, it could take 0.5 seconds. You don't actually know. So what you do is you end up making a request, and then when that request is finalized, you can use a .then, which means that that has finished, and it will then execute code when that has finished. There's a couple other things that you can do, such as callbacks, which is a little bit older way of programming, but is still perfectly valid, and you'll see a lot of libraries that do that. So introducing NPM. So Node.js is the platform, which means its features and APIs are kept to a minimum. To achieve more complex functionality, it uses a module system that allows you to expand the platform. The best way to install, update, and remove Node.js modules is using the NPM, which is the Node Package Manager. So NPM has the following main features. It has a registry of packages to browse, download, and install third-party modules, and a CLI tool to manage local and global dependencies. So I'll quickly open that up just to show you guys. So this is NPM. You're kind of, oh, you can't. 1 second. Okay, so this is NPM. It's just a site that basically has a search box. You can search for what you're wanting to do, and it will find other libraries that are usually trying to solve the exact same problem that you're trying to do. Because JavaScript it's not like normal languages where you will have almost a tool for everything that's out there. There's a lot of modules that you have to install, or you can do it yourself, but that does take longer. So one good example is a library that's called Moment. And working with dates in JavaScript can be a little bit complex, especially because when you start to deal with adding dates and managing, leap years and months that have different days, you can see where it starts to come into complexity, especially once you start adding time zones into the mix. So there's a library that's called Moment, and you can see that it's right here. And when you go in, you can see how many downloads it's had in the last week, what version, licensing, stuff like that. And then usually there's some form of documentation that comes alongside of it. So in this case, they have an external link to documentation where you can kind of go through and see how the entire library works. Not every library that you use and download will probably be as nice as this. Some of them you might be looking at a very specific problem, and it might have 500 downloads in the last month, and it's made by one guy. So NPM is great because you can create however much code that you want and be able to share it with other people in the same way that open source is done. But what this does is it's a platform to allow people to use your open source code. So you can download. I will show you a quick example of how that works. So in this case, I have that file, and I'm going to install Moment. So you use npm, you type install, and then you want whatever module that you're trying to install. So it will run. And now in my folder, there we go. So I have a node modules folder, which this is where it keeps all of your modules that you've just installed. And then you also have a package lock file. We'll go over kind of what those things do later on. But now I can use Moment however I want. So in this case, if I open up my code editor, I can this is how you will require in the module that you just installed. And from there, you can take and then if we run that code, so what I just did there was I just ran the constructor for Moment, which just takes the current date and time by default, and then allows you to format it. So by looking at the documentation for Moment, you can go to display, and down here it will show you all the different combinations that you can use to display a date of how you want. So you can do a day of the month that has it just as the number. You can also have it so that it has a padding of 0 at the start for consistency. You can display it as a number with first, second, etc. As well as you can also display the day of the week, and really any sort of combination that you would think of a date, either as a number or as a string, is available. So in this case, I could take 2 M's, capital is that, and then we could also do 3. So now when I run this code, we have Jan 01, 2019. So that's how you use npm to install a module. And again, all of these are, you can kind of just search through and see the different things that are available. But the two main things, as I said, is an online repository kind of similar to GitHub where you can see all the code, and then a CLI tool for downloading and managing those things. So using npm, as I just showed you, you can do npm install and then the package name, and that will install it onto your machine. You can also use a -g command to install the package globally. So the difference is when you type npm install, any files that are in that folder will be able to access it, but once you go to another folder, it won't be able to access it. So you'll have to npm install it again, or you can install it as a global package, and then you can request it into your other files. So for the example, because we're going to be using Express, it shows here that you can type npm install Express, and that will install it to your local folder. The preceding command will install the latest stable version of the Express package in your local node modules folder. And when it comes to versioning of modules on npm, it uses what is called semantic versioning, which has a major number at the first, followed by a period, then a minor, followed by a period, and then a patch number. And what that does is there is kind of a best practices that is around versioning, so that way people don't install a module that will end up breaking their application. So when you end up having something that is a breaking change, you will usually bump up a version number for your major. If it's just more new features that don't end up breaking anything else, you will bump up a minor. And if it's just kind of fixes for known issues, that will usually be followed by a patch number bump. So as I said, let's quickly show you how that looks. Okay. So we now have this package.json file, which is used to manage all of your packages that you have installed as dependencies. So in this case for Express, you can see that it's at 4.16.4, which stands for, it has version 4 for a major, 16 as a minor, and 4 as a patch. That little up arrow at the front of it means that when you install this application on another computer and you npm install, it will actually use any minor version. So as long as the major has not increased, it hasn't got to 5 dot something, it will always be able to install the latest thing and you get the latest greatest thing without having to manage anything. When you start working with, you can update this, of course, at any time to whatever version that you want. You can bump it down to a lesser version if you end up finding out that the newest version does not work. And then from there, you can just manage your dependencies, which when you start getting into more complex applications, rather than just showing you how this works, you'll kind of see how it comes into being pretty useful. So when I use /save, what that did is it appended Express into the dependencies of my package file, which, as I said, the package file is used to really explain everything that is about your application. So it'll have your name, it'll have the version that it's currently at, your dependencies. You can use dev dependencies if you're only doing something that will be local versus on the actual server. And then other things as well. Different libraries will read from your package file. Then you can also uninstall in the same way. So instead of typing install, you type uninstall with the same package name and it will uninstall it from your machine. Again, using the -g flag will uninstall it from your global. You can type update. This will update your package, followed by -g will update the global package. So we kind of see a very common pattern of how to update this. So when you start managing dependencies in your package.json file, it displays it, you can update them. But if you have your own packages, you have a name, version, and author. And this kind of explains who you are and what it does, really. There's also a description that is available. So if you end up writing something and putting it onto NPM, it will use your package file to display the metadata of your application. So here is an example. The name is, in this case, mean, version 001, and dependencies express and grunt. So you can also, there's a couple keywords that you can use that will allow you to just install whatever the most recent version is, which in this case you can use the word latest. Or you can also just, again, as I said, you can use the versioning number that is provided when you type npm install. To create this file, you type npm init, and it will ask you a series of questions about your application, so you don't actually have to manually create this. So as you saw here, that photo is not very good. So it asked me what my package name is going to be. By default, it takes the folder that you're currently in, the version being starting at 1.0.0, asks you a description. Again, a lot of these are optional and default to most likely what you're probably going to use anyway. The entry point being what is the first file that needs to be executed from your application. Usually this is what is the entry point being where everything else ends up running from, like a main file. You can test your code. You can put in your Git repository, keywords, author, and the license, and then it will auto-generate the file for you without much work. Again, most of these you're not going to really matter about this because it's just really understanding how the tools work. As long as you do an npm install and your files show up, that's what's the important part. So after creating your package file, you can install your modules with -save, and when you deploy up to any sort of platform, it will automatically download and install those modules when you run it. Let's see. So node modules. So JavaScript has turned out to be a pretty powerful language with some unique features that enable efficient yet maintainable programming. Its closure pattern and event-driven behavior have proven to be very helpful in real-life scenarios, but all programming languages aren't perfect, and one of its major design flaws is the global namespace. So in Node, and just kind of a part of the modules, you can have two modules that have the exact same name, which they've come out with different things to be able to fix that. But before, you would type npm install moment, and if there were two libraries that were called moment, it kind of had an issue with that. So now there's the common JS modules that allow you to require in stuff a lot easier. So it was a project that was started in 2009 to standardize the way of working with JavaScript outside the browser. The standards, there's basically three main parts. So there's the require, which as you saw in my other file, I had required in moment into the file. Then there's exports, which this is used to be able to export code so that way someone else can require it in. And then there's module, which the object was originally used to provide metadata. Really, there's not a lot of module stuff that you'll see. It's mostly exports and require. So here is a quick example of it exporting a function that's called hello that just console logs the message of hello. So in this case, you would require in this, and you would, when you required it in, you would say like module equals require module, and then you would do module.sayHello, and you would execute that function and it would run that code. I can show you right here. So there it is where it's requiring in the hello file into a variable called hello, and then it runs hello.sayHello. There's a couple different ways when we start working with React that you'll see will be a little bit different. There is an import and export as opposed to require and exports. Just because JavaScript is starting to work on being able to import and export a lot easier. But because there is a lot of tooling that you can actually use those features without having to worry about it being an issue. So core modules are modules that are already built into the Node library. These are going to be files that you can write to the file system, being able to do events, A lot of different things that are kind of built in already. So as I said, these come pre-bundled with Node, access to the file system, HTTP and HTTPS interfaces, and much more. To require these in, you use the same require, and you can just look at the documentation that is on the Node site to see what things are currently in it. Yeah, so here's an example of using the file system to read a file from the computer and then just console log out what the result of that file is. So when we start developing Node.js web applications, it supports a bunch of different types. So you can write like a full website in it. You could write, if anyone's familiar with microservices that are tiny applications that just kind of really do one specific thing. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can write the code to do the same thing, as I'm sure you guys are aware. You can do, a for loop, a while loop. It just really depends on the way that you want to write it, and JavaScript is no different. In fact, it can be a little bit more complex because there's sometimes more ways to do it. So there's many modules to support web application development, but none are as popular as the Connect module. Connect delivers a set of wrappers around Node.js low-level APIs to enable the development of rich web application frameworks. So in this case, to understand what Connect is all about, here's a basic example of a Node application where we require in the HTTP module, we create a server, and then we write the head, which is the headers that are sent when you make a request to a web application. And then it does res.end with the content. So if you were to take this code and run it in a module that you have and you run it with Node, if you tried to go to localhost 3000, you would get hello world just as a plain text in your browser, as well as if you examine the headers, you would see that it's text plain. This is what writing a web server in Node is kind of like, which is why we will be using Express, because it removes a lot of this of having to create this. It makes it a lot faster. So as I said, when you write Node server into your terminal, you'll be able to go to localhost 3000 in your browser, and you'll see hello world. So how does this work? So the HTTP module is used to create a small web server listening on the 3000 port. You begin by requiring the HTTP module and use the create server method to return a new server object. As I said, HTTP is included by default with Node, and it comes with the create server where you give it the port and what it needs to do. The listen method is used to listen to port 3000, and there is a callback that is on create server. So as you can see right here, you have HTTP create server, and then it passes it a function. So what that function does is when create server is done running, it will actually execute that function. So instead of doing an event, in this case, you just pass it what is called a callback that will execute code when it is done. So the callback gets called when the HTTP request is sent to the server. The server object will then pass the REQ and RES arguments for request and response, which contain the information and functionality needed to send back an HTTP response. The callback function will then do the following two steps. It'll write to the head, and it will also end with text. So as I kind of explained, res.write will write hello world, so that way it knows what to respond back with, and then end will end the request. Yes? So the HTTP header is a lot of metadata that is sent back from the server. So when you make a request to a server, you can send particular information. So in the case of if you go to Google and you're signed in, one of the headers that you send to Google is an authentication header. And that usually allows them to know that you are you. And if you override that, it won't work. So just to quickly show you. So this is where you can look at the headers that are sent both as a request and a response. You, in this case, are the request, and the response, in this case, would be moment.js. So you can see that it has a header that's called accept, and this is stating what your browser is allowing as valid data to send back. Encoding, language, cache control, a lot of these are set up by your browser, and you'd never have to worry about them. The response headers are sent back, and it states what, again, more metadata information. So in this case, it has a GitHub request ID, and that is sent customly by them. The date expires, last modified. This is all information that would most likely be used to know when the page was last modified or last updated, and just the current time, so that way you can compare it. I just did all of that, and you can, you guys couldn't see that, my bad. Sorry. So if you're using Chrome, when you right-click and go into Inspect, you have your Chrome DevTools. You can go into Network and view the files that have been sent back. And in this case, you have your response headers right here and your request headers right here. So this is just a big list of everything that you have sent with metadata and they have sent back alongside the actual content of the page. So for the most part, you don't have to worry about it because we're going to be using Express, which will handle a lot of it. It has a lot of helpful functions that automatically handle headers and stuff like that. But it is good to know sometimes there's information that you want to send alongside data. So in a case of requesting data from a database, you could say how many total items there are alongside like your pagination, current page, total pages, stuff like that. So it makes it, on the development side, you can make it a little bit easier. So Connect is a module built in to support interception of requests in a more modular approach. The first web server example, you learned how to build a simple web server using the HTTP module. So actually, I guess you want to what? I'll try to see if we can get it working on our machines with Node, because I'm sure you guys are probably already sick of listening to me. So what we're going to do is take this code that was up there a second ago, and we're going to create a file on our system. So what we can do is, doesn't matter where you end up putting the file. In this case, I'm just going to create a folder that's called COMP2106 001 Hello World. So once you've created the folder of however you're going to be doing this, you can just create a small file that's just called index.js. And then open it. In this case, I just right-clicked inside of the folder and just created a new file. Yeah, no worries. So the first thing that we're going to be doing once we've created this new file is we're going to be requiring in the HTTP module that is provided by Node. So in this case, as you guys know in JavaScript, there's 3 different keywords that you can use to create a variable. There is const, let, and var. Yep. Yep. Oh. One sec.
I think it's a contrast. That's all.
Yeah. I'll probably end up changing my theme to a light theme so that you guys can read a little bit easier. Yeah, it's a little bit darker up there. Okay. So once you've required in the HTTP module, this is where you can start using it. So in the slides here, I'll just copy paste this, but so http.create server, and then this is where you then give it what is called a callback. And the callback is executed when create server is done, and it will listen on port 3000. So another thing that you could do, just to explain this a little bit more, you can create a function that is called when done, and that, I guess I'll do it as a normal function. Function when done. So what this does is when it's done creating the server, it will execute this line of code where it will write to the head text plain and end with hello world, listening on port 3000. So is anyone still writing that?
Oh yeah.
So when you Yes, I did go a little quick on that. I'm just mostly showing.
To copy this out or just to listen?
Sorry?
Are you wanting us to copy this?
You're welcome to. Just if you want to like follow it through and just kind of see how it works, you don't have to. Of course, all of these are going to be on Blackboard as well as on YouTube, but you're more than welcome to. If you have any questions or if I'm going too fast, just let me know. Like that.
That's on your slide.
Yep. Yep. It's going to be on slide 34 when it's posted up. Again, I really apologize that you guys don't have access, or I don't have access to Blackboard yet, or else all of these you guys would be able to have access to it. So just by looking at this code, is there anything that anyone would like to ask just about it? Want to know how it works or what it's doing? Maybe it's not clear. I've kind of explained it a couple times, but go on.
Okay, so we're creating a server using that thing we imported,
Yep.
and then it's got a callback function.
Yep.
That sends stuff in the head,
Mm-hmm.
and then it returns hello world.
Yes. So,
Also listen 3000.
so with HTTP, you've created the server, but it needs a port, so that way you can access it. Otherwise, it's not running on anything. So when you put 3000, so let's see, I am running this right now. So I'm sorry for people that are still typing it. But when you type in localhost 3000, that's what it's doing right now. So if I were to actually change that to a different number, let's say it's 5000, and change this to 5000, now it's running on 5000 as opposed to 3000. For some reason, and I don't know how it started or why, but most node programs will run on port 3000 by default. That's kind of just what people typically put it at. It's a kind of safe port number to use, but really at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what port you're running it on as long as you know what it's running on. Yep. Sorry?
How do you start running the server?
So to start running it, as long as you are in the same folder that you created that index.js file, in your command prompt, you will type in node, and then index.js. And then it will log out that your server is running, and then you can open that up in Chrome. Yep.
Could you just run over those parameters, REQ and RES?
So REQ and RES, what are you asking about? I'm sorry?
So what are those parameters, like regarding?
So when you create the server, it will automatically send in REQ and RES, and those stand for the request, meaning that would be the user that is making the request, and the response being what you are sending back. So that is why in here we have RES write head, we're writing to the response of what we're going to send back, and then RES end is ending that connection. So that way, if I were to put anything else after, yeah, it will not run. In fact, in most cases, usually it yells at you. And I'm running on port 3000 again. So you'll see here that it says res.send is not a function. Oh, that's because it doesn't exist, but kind of get the idea. You can't send anything after you have ended the connection. So sometimes it's a little bit easier to understand it just by typing in that. But in the case of this, usually you can so this is everything that is sent to the server when you make a request. It has a bunch of information, which really there's too much to even look at. But this is where you can see that they hit the URL /. They use a method of get, which when you guys are familiar with doing forms, there's get and post. There's also other ones that you can also use when you start using front-end frameworks, such as delete, patch, put. There's a couple different ones that all mean different things. But in this case, it's using a GET request on just the index of the application. So there's a bunch of information that is sent, as well as if you were to do like a query parameters of like a search. So somewhere in here would be the search parameters that we just used. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff that's in here, and it's hard to see it all. So here's the URL, and there'll be other stuff that's in there. But really, for this sake, you don't necessarily need to know much about the request. Just the response is what you are sending back. Any other questions about the code that's here? You don't always. I believe by default, if you don't do the content type, it will default to text plain. In this case, because we're using the function .end, it doesn't know what your content type is going to be, but there are other ones that you can use, such as, I believe this should be there. I apologize if I'm going a little quick on this, but okay. So that's actually where coming into using Express, there's a bunch of wrappers that are around it that when you start sending data will automatically put those in for you so you don't have to. The HTTP module kind of just gives you the bare bones of what you need to do, and then you can kind of build around it, which is a little bit nice, so that way you can do those very low-level things that if you have to. But as I said, like Express is a module that people have already done it, and you don't really have to. So, any other questions? Feel free to ask. So we kind of explained how this works. You create the server, it listens on port 3000, and the code that is in it is sent through the response object. When you have the callback function that is fired whenever there's an HTTP request. I believe I went over that. Connect. So let's do it here. So Connect creates an API exactly for that purpose. It uses a modular component called a middleware, which allows you to simply register your application logic. The Connect middleware is basically a callback function which gets executed when an HTTP request occurs. The middleware can perform some logic, return a response, or call the next registered middleware. So a middleware is when you create your server, and then it's what is executed between the request has been made to the server and when it has responded back. Usually you can use these things for authorization and authentication. You can do it to execute different things. You could like read from a file, do a bunch, really like any sort of code that you're doing, you can run between those two parts. So chances are we actually are going to be writing some custom middleware, which is pretty easy to do once we start using Express. And it just, you can, again, get it to run on certain parts in the website, or you can get it to run everywhere. So the way a Connect application works is by using an object called a dispatcher. The dispatcher object handles each HTTP request received by the server and then decides in a cascading way the order of middleware execution. So in this case, it connects and listens on port 3000. It's a little bit more basic. We're not going to bother using the connect module just because it's actually a little bit similar to how we're going to be using Express. So in that case, we might as well just use Express. But you want to what? Actually, let's write this out. Oh, come on. Okay, so this code does pretty much the exact same thing that we just did, except now it uses the Connect middleware to be able to do a bunch of different things. So as you can see, instead of having to require in the HTTP module, we're now requiring in Connect, which we had to install using npm install. And then it connects. And then in this case, we have a function that instead of just having request and response, it also has a third option that is called next. And what next will do is it allows it to be passed from middleware to middleware. So because it goes in order of when the middleware is registered. So if I were to register it twice, this one would get executed first, and then this one would get executed after, but it won't because it is using res.end. So if I were to use next inside here, if I had two different functions, it would do the first one, and then it would go and do the second one. So I'm just going to quickly one sec. Okay, so in this case I have two functions. The first one is just going to log out hit me, and then it will execute next, which will then pass it to the second middleware that's called second world. And this is the one that will then set the header and respond back with hello world. So if I were to run that, you can see that it says hello world right here. But when I open up my terminal, there it is right there. I believe it's because I refreshed. Oh no, it's doing it twice. Where's the part where it's console logging that? Huh. I don't use Connect as much just because, again, Express is much better. It shouldn't be console logging twice, but not sure. That's a good question. So in this case, it does something very similar to what we just did before. In this case, it just has what is called a middleware, which is just code that is executed before it ends up finishing. So you can really register as many middlewares as you want. The only issue is the more middlewares that you start to register, there's more code that is going to be executed before there's the final response. So for a user, you always want it to respond usually as quick as possible. So you do sometimes have to watch your middlewares, but a lot of the code that we're going to be writing is just going to be very quick. There's not a lot of complexity that's going to be involved, so it's not going to take very long. And we're also going to be running it on our machines. So does anyone have any questions besides the console log twice about the code that's up here? No. All right. So it's 1:15. I'm assuming you guys, what is it, a 20, 30 minute break? 15, 20 minutes? Whatever you guys prefer. Do you guys want one break or two? Yeah. Well, how about we'll do just a big break right now. Figure that's pretty good where we are right now. If anyone has to like go to the bathroom or do whatever, you do that. So we'll, let's say, back by 1:30. Cool. All right.
So are you teaching the entire semester? Because I'm not sure if you're still on class.
Yes. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing to you, but
We'll find out.
yeah. Like I said, like I got the call to teach this class about like a week and a half before the.
Semesters ago too, yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, yeah. It's waiting. I'm really sorry you have a teacher.
I'm sorry, I asked if you could.
Some of these things were, those are the same slides. It's the same slides. So, like, I don't know how that recognized. Yeah.
This is probably before
No, so like Tom is very big.
What? I had no idea. I kid you not, when we saw that you were not rich anymore, like, I didn't.
Oh, really? See, I really enjoyed it. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I had it for a lot of. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like a lot of people just kind of more design. And so
That's what the
it's
program
like a
used
little
to
bit.
be. When I started, it was like you guys
No, interactive web development, interactive media design dash web. Dash web. Yeah, they did change the name.
They can do it every year.
Yeah. I think it was like.
They're gonna be.
Yeah.
So the fact that, like I said, means that there's a lot of front-end people, but there are applications that are, like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with COMP.
Yeah.
So that you can
Are we ever?
desktop applications that like there's so many like word lines on what is desktop and what is node. So I mean like React Native like front end code that ends up getting actually compiled into native code for iOS and Android, but it's like if you're actually writing Android, it's like so it's very light on what's what. Right. That's why they're you guys already have a bunch of shared courses.
Yeah. Exciting. Me too. I'm frozen right now. Yeah, it's cold in here.
Yeah.
Frigid. Frigid heat there. I support it.
My pretty
It's 18.6.
Oh my god. Yeah, that's cold. Jesus.
Oh, it's set point 13.5.
So this is your guys' last semester, right?
Yes.
You guys got any plans for post school?
Cry. Career, not just a job. It's not like
Cry until I find a job and then cry when I get some more because I'll be so stressed.
Yeah.
So where are you working?
I work from home.
Okay.
You were in fun. Where?
It's called Smash Reality.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
I interviewed there last year.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Oh, you
Yeah, so it seems like a really cool place.
It is. Yeah.
Or did I looked at it. I did see it up there. I was like, oh, it's close to home. That's lit. And
Smash Reality was right beside At Bank. You guys have seen that one as well. We do a lot of like blockchain and marketing and stuff.
Is it on this like on here Ontario?
Sorry.
Is it on here Ontario Street?
It's on the first. It's like literally right beside Smash Reality. Is that like 1 First Street? LCBO.
Oh, okay.
Small town, and you know, it's the one liquor store.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like right in that blah blah LCBO.
Barrie, say the LCF, which one?
Alright.
Yeah,
Okay.
they like expanded a lot, so I remember like when I was there, like last year, they were like, let's just like,
So you probably would
yeah, like,
so that would have been, so they finished the renovation in January. I actually started there in August. But we've expanded a little bit. Like there's 7 employees that do like
yeah.
that's like too much. It's good though. Like I enjoy it. It's we started at the beginning. No, I live in
Yeah,
it's 15.
like I live in Vegas, so like you live in 45 minutes.
One of the people that works there, she lives in Minnesota. So it's like our drive, and she still doesn't have any tires. programming or design?
I mean, I kind of like doing both, but I feel like my strength is definitely in design. What did you guys do?
Year and a half ago?
And if you just go to naturality?
No, so I was up in Midland, at a company called Ski Group, and I was there for a year, and then I started in August.
It's not a beautiful place. Where was it?
Barrie.
Barrie, yeah. It
Barrie,
seemed like a